Dying is inevitable. It happens to all of us. But how we acknowledge death and dying is a very personal experience. With our guest and expert, we'll explore the etiquette, rites and traditions seen in multicultural Australia and around the world. Someone who knows about the rites and traditions is Dr. Hannah Gould, an anthropologist working in the areas of death, religion and material culture. We're also going to be joined by Tracy Spicer, and she's a Walkley Award-winning author, journalist and broadcaster. And she's an ambassador for Dying with Dignity. Tracy and Hannah, welcome. Thanks so much.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Let's talk death.
Why not? That'll be lots of fun.
Do you laugh in the face of death?
What else can you do? I mean, look, lots of sadness, lots of joy. Every single emotion is reasonable, surely. I mean, It's like the question, the ultimate question of philosophy, of history, of every discipline. Every response is valid.
Yeah.
Not always useful or helpful.
Yeah.
But valid.
Yeah.
Well, it's a universal topic of conversation, and that's why I've always loved dark humour, because you do have to laugh. Otherwise, what do you do?
I also think it is the ultimate joke that we are all going to die, but we live like we're not going to. We live every day as though it's just not going to happen at all.
Especially in Western society, I think other cultures have got it right, and we're in such deep denial about it. It's detrimental to all of us.
Yeah. Now, this is your area of expertise, really, is it? Do other cultures have it right?
Everyone does it differently. Right or wrong is kind of a difficult thing to judge. I think certainly there's a big thing called like the denial of death thesis, right? And people like Ernst Becker, a lot of different philosophers and anthropologists and cultural analysis have looked at Western culture and gone, oh my gosh, we are so invested in denying death, right? And whether that's through denying death by religions that say you're going to live forever, like, don't worry, it's not the end, you'll walk off to heaven or whatever it is. Or through, great heroic myths. Yes, you'll die, but the nation will remember you forever. So, you won't really die, you'll be a martyr. Or contemporary, yes, you'll die, but have you seen how great the shopping is?
Right.
We can just ignore, we can deny death by being on Instagram and, consuming, right?
Yeah.
So I think Western culture in particular, the way we've organised our society allows us to not think about death.
And we've organised death to be somewhere else usually now, to be
Incredibly.
in the hospital, to be in palliative care somewhere. They may be good, but they're not in the cottage, are they? They're not next to it, not in the bedroom.
Not in the bedroom. So we know that, say, 70% of Australians wish to die at home. Only about 15% do. And that is a rate that is lower than all these other countries we like to compare ourselves. So Australians are more institutionalised in their death than places like Ireland, like New Zealand, the United States of America, even Canada. We tend, more than other countries, to die in institutions, aged care, hospitals and hospices.
Yeah, right. The other way in which we deny death or the other way in which other cultures have a different attitude to death will be that it'll be to be more accepting. We are all going to die. Yeah. We'll be part of their everyday. Or they may have a notion of reincarnation and coming back, which means that that's a very different attitude to death, really, than a heaven and a hell.
Yeah, it's not necessarily an end so much. I think that's kind of quite common in, say, Buddhist or Hindu or other kind of Dharmic religions, particularly Asian religions. And then obviously there's a lot of Asian religion that's part of Australian society, so that's also quite present in Australia. But we can also have a kind of more secular idea about that. A lot of my mum's generation in particular have kind of a green environmental kind of reincarnation model where she will say, well, I don't particularly believe in heaven, but I do believe I'm going to become compost, food for worms, I'll come back as a tree or a flower or a tomato plant, and that's a kind of reincarnation of like reintegration into the natural environment, as it were. So there are some kind of myths or stories we can tell ourselves that perhaps help us think about death.
Yeah. I've got a friend of mine who'd be into her 80s who said, funeral, just put me up the top paddock, let the crows have a go.
My dad wants to be buried in a cardboard box, and I think that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah. We all say that, don't we? That's a really common one as well. I hear that a lot on the radio. People will go, mate, I don't care. Put me out on the hard rubbish day.
In the paddock, whatever
Put me out
it
in the paddock, the same sort of thing I said, do we really want that, do you think?
Oh, do we really want that? I do think Aussies are pretty pragmatic about death. I do think we have a certain streak in us that's kind of like, you know what, it's all a bit much fuss, it's all too much. And you kind of even get these people who therefore say, don't have a funeral. I really don't want to have a funeral. Please don't even, no fuss. That can be kind of sad sometimes because I think it's some people kind of not acknowledging how many people love them and miss them.
Yeah.
But maybe it's also a bit of an Aussie humour, dry humour, that black humour again of kind of, trying to laugh in the face of death.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I would agree, but then we all get sucked in when we're in the funeral home.
Oh, gosh.
And they show you the cardboard box and then they show you the glossy one that's $10,000 or $20,000 and you think, did I really love that person that much? Should I do it? So it all feeds into what you were talking about before, that consumerism and over-commercialisation.
Well, I also think sometimes I would think it's about weddings and funerals. Well, who's it actually for?
Well, it's a punctuation mark, isn't it? I'm a lifelong atheist, but I do enjoy, it sounds terrible, going to those kind of ceremonies, whether it's a funeral or a wedding, because it's important to celebrate or commemorate these changes, these huge changes.
I love the sharing of stories at a funeral. People start talking.
Well, you learn so much about someone's life that you may not have known. And also often they're rich for that dark humour. I'll never forget my grandmother's funeral, who I was incredibly close to. And my father's new girlfriend loved my grandmother. She was so distraught, she tried to throw herself into the hole in the ground on top when she was throwing the dirt in. And I thought, well, that's intense.
That's good.
I've never seen that before. That's a first.
Oh, I've seen that before.
Have you?
Really?
I will say that, when you attend enough funerals or attend enough cremations for professional reasons, as it were, you kind of see everything, every range of human emotions. Like we kind of think, all funerals are all happy families. A lot of unhappy families, a lot of punch-ups at funerals, lots of mistresses coming out of the woodwork at funerals, conversions, religious, more and more people have recorded messages from beyond the grave that they play at their funeral, or they've decided that we're having a dance party or we're having some sort of festivity or an event. I mean, you can do anything these days with a funeral.
Do you go to a lot to observe?
Yeah, I do my research. So I research in death and dying, and I work at a crematorium, and I attend funerals, and I hang around with other people in the death care sector.
Yeah.
And you do see everything.
Why do you want to?
Interested?
No, we'll both do it. I think you've done this sort of thing. So, yeah. Well, why do you want to be around death?
Oh, I mean, personal and professional. Professional, I'm an anthropologist, and anthropologists want to know what brings us together, what makes us all human, but then also why we do it so differently. And there is nothing else. It is the question, right? It is the one thing we all experience, and yet we've all decided to do it in completely different ways and completely different ways throughout history. And then personally, my dad died, and I thought, gosh, what on earth is going on? I suddenly was given the catalogue of coffins, right?
And you were young.
I was 22, 23 when my dad died. An age that was perfectly old and mature at the time, I thought. But looking back, obviously, it was incredibly young. But yeah, I suddenly got handed this catalogue of kind of coffins, and they all had these really naff names, like, these rich mahoganies, and it was like paint colours. Someone somewhere had decided these were the options, right? That this is what was going to represent my dad. And I just felt this massive disconnect. And I thought, hang on, I've got to work out what's going on there. So now I spend my life in death.
Yeah. I suppose, most of us would think being around death would be a very gloomy kind of thing to be. It's a way to spend your day.
It can be very gloomy, but oh my gosh, the gallows humour that those boys in the crematorium tell.
Yeah. Is there a joke you can share?
Ooh, not a lot of them are safe for work or anywhere.
Tracy, you were going to jump in and ask something there before. What were you going to ask? Fellow professional interviewer.
I really see a connection with you being 22 when your father died, and I was 32 when my mother died. Even at 32, I felt like I wasn't ready for it.
No.
Yeah. And especially because it happened so quickly. Mum was the linchpin for the family, smart and funny, and she could do anything. She was one of those early superwomen kind of role models. And then all of a sudden at the age of 51, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer with 7 months to live, and she lived 7 months almost to the day.
Wow.
And it was blood and guts and gore. She was in agonising pain. My sister and I were injecting her with medication every day. We wanted her to die in the home. But it got to the stage we had to bring her to palliative care, and that's when we started having the conversations about voluntary assisted dying, because Mum and Dad had always said, put me down like a dog. And again, it's one of those things that you think it's going to be easy at the time, but it's not. We talked to the doctor. The doctor said, I don't want to end up in jail. And my sister sat there with the morphine button. She pressed it so often she had a bruise on her thumb. And we said, surely you can just increase the morphine, because Mum was having breakthrough pain.
Right.
So everything everything was fine until she'd scream once an hour, and there was no way they could cap that. So it's cruel, right?
Yeah.
It's cruel. I don't think there's any way they would have done it. We tried to have those conversations, which is why one night, because we were sleeping in a chair next to her overnight, just to hold her hand when she was in pain, I picked up the pillow and I did try to put it over her face because I thought, what kind of daughter am I to let her suffer? And then I stopped at the last minute, and then I felt really ashamed of,
No, but
what a coward I am.
No, I was
know?
going to say the opposite. What an incredibly brave act to have so much love and compassion for this person and so much respect what you knew her wishes would be, that you were willing to do that, not to her, for her, right? That's extraordinary.
It's lovely of you to say.
Did she know what you were doing?
Oh, no, she was out of it for about the previous 2 weeks, actually, in and out of it. And then she died in the next 24 hours anyway, so she was very, very close. And she'd had that kind of burst. You know how they have that almost honeymoon period a couple of days beforehand where you think, well, she seems like she's getting better.
Right.
And we read about that, so we expected she was close.
The final burst.
Yeah, is there a name for that?
I don't know what it's called, but, that is when usually the palliative care doctors, the hospice workers will call up the family and say, guess what? They're up and about, they're talking, they're eating all of a sudden. And that's genuinely usually a sign that it's not going to be long.
Wow.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
It's the final burst of energy. One of the interesting things about the rise of voluntary assisted dying, of euthanasia, to speak more broadly in Australia, is it reflects this kind of cultural shift that we have about the importance of choice and control towards the end of our life, and how increasingly that is becoming an important part of what we think about as a good death, right? Like, I want to be able to control where I die and who I die with and when, and the pain and suffering, right? And that hasn't always been the case, right? Throughout history, there's been periods of that. There's been periods of leave it to God, or there's also been periods of, yes, I must prepare. I have to write my final last note or poetry or whatever it is. But that's increasingly becoming important, particularly we see within the baby boomer generation, that they really want to, have some sort of choice and emphasis on choice.
Well, I wonder whether a lot of it is a reaction to the medical control over the end of our lives is so extreme that we can be kept alive for so long, and so it's a reaction to that medical control, isn't it? To want to say, well, surely we can have both, can't we? You can either keep me alive if I don't want to be kept alive. Could you let me go?
Yeah. It's one of the great paradoxes. They talk about this paradox of contemporary death and contemporary medicine, is that all of our interventions have increased, right? The medicalisation of death has meant that not only we have pain control, but we can keep people alive for longer. We have better medicines, drugs, palliative medicine is massively advanced. And yet, if we ask people, the quality of death and dying has not increased.
Right.
And if we look globally, more access to medicine doesn't necessarily correlate with a higher quality of death and dying. There's some correlation, like, do you actually have the drugs? Can you access them? But when it gets to kind of over a certain hurdle, just because you're dying in Australia versus dying in a country with no resources doesn't mean you're going to die better.
And what's a quality of death? How are we measuring that? What do you mean by that?
There's lots of things you can do to measure it, and people try. So one of them is, to ask the family, to ask the dying person, to also ask the physician, did you think this was a good death? How do we assess it? Because it's not just up to the dying person as well. Of course, it's also up to the family, right? How did you experience that death, that dying? It's a difficult thing to measure, right? Because for some people, death is never going to be.
Yeah.
The words good death, bad death are kind of controversial now, because it's like, oh my God, I have to try and everything else. Do I also have to live up to a good death?
Yeah.
Right? Like, we can't make it good. Can we make it better?
Yeah. What do you think is a good death, Tracy?
I think this really intersects with competition. Everything's become a competition. And also quality of aging.
Yes.
Because my darling dad, who's 84 and still hanging on after smoking and drinking himself almost to death when he was in his 50s, it's a miracle he's still alive. He has very close to zero quality of life. He's a lovely man. We love spending time with him, but he can barely walk. Where's the quality of life? So I've just written a book about artificial intelligence recently. So it worries me, that medtech space, that we're getting people to live longer, but there's no quality of life and also no quality of death.
Yeah.
And it's this phenomenon we actually call, in scholarship, we call it prolonged dwindling.
Oh,
which is
so true. I
what a
love that.
term. But it's
Sounds like the worst Enya album ever.
and it never ends.
But yeah, it's exactly this thing, right? So it used to be, if you look at like the kind of time, it used to be that you'd either have a sudden illness, fall off a horse, through a sword, war back in the day, and then you would die, or you would have a serious major illness like a cancer or a heart attack, and then pretty soon after you die, right? What we tend to have now is these kind of timelines towards the end of life of multiple hospitalizations in and out of hospital, or you have something like Alzheimer's, right, where you have a very, very, very slow and long cognitive decline, potentially with very high care needs. So you're in hospital, you're in care for 20, 30 years, right? Which is unheard of previously, that you would need this level. So how we die is changing, and it's a completely different timeline.
Yeah. Trace, let's just return to this moment when you started to perhaps really think about death. You're confronting your mother's suffering, and you think about, taking control of that, about doing something. Was that an impulse? Was it something that grew over time?
It was knowing my mother's character as being very forthright, and she was always in control, to speak to control. She would have liked me to try to control the situation. It was also, obviously, that you never want to see a loved one in suffering. But it taught all of us in the family a couple of important lessons. Dad's now got an advanced care directive that's 28 pages long.
Very well done.
Exactly what's going to happen. My husband and I still haven't done that. But we do talk to our kids who are aged 18 and 20 about this kind of stuff. I think part of that is my husband's a camera operator. I've been a long-time journalist. So in newsrooms, very dark sense of humour, similar to the crematoriums. So we talk about death and dying an awful lot at home. But I think it's important to have those conversations and to prepare for a good enough death as much as you can. I mean, what does a good enough death mean to you? Have you thought about that yourself?
Yeah, well, I have. I've had some, health issues, had a cancer last year, and so that sort of thing, you do start to confront it and think about it. I'm the fall asleep in the bed. Go to bed one night, don't wake up.
Classic.
That's the classic. Give me the classic. I'm happy with the classic. Like what?
Hopefully after you've just finished penning your magnum opus, surrounded by friends and family.
The end. For me to be on stage, I've just finished a searing saxophone solo. Everyone's just unbelievable. Down you go. Something like, sudden seems to be this thing, just immediate and sudden, no suffering.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, people always ask me, do you fear death? Are you afraid of death? Frankly, after studying it for this long, no, not at all. And I think in an odd way, there is some kind of a horrific privilege of having at least one of your parents die young, because all of a sudden you do start thinking about all these things, and you learn to live with death, even if you don't like it a lot of the time. I don't fear death. I do fear the prolonged dwindling. Yeah. Right? Like that, the kind of aging poorly without support in a way that I can't make the controls and, can't make decisions. That's much more scary than me. Death. Death is kind of a great mystery.
Yeah. Your interaction with your mother, Tracy, led you to looking at voluntary assisted dying. What did people say about it? What was the general, when you first started to talk about it, when you first started to campaign for it, what would people say?
What I noticed was a disconnect, that people in the community overwhelmingly supported this because they'd seen loved ones die. But in our parliaments, I saw there are a lot of people, a higher percentage than the normal population, are quite religious in our parliaments.
Completely unrepresentative.
Unrepresentative. And so a lot of organised religions are pushing back against it, and therefore there wasn't an appetite for change because of that. I think it took these wonderful lobby groups to get the politicians to listen and for them to realise that there was a groundswell of support. And also, of course, with the examples in the Netherlands and Oregon and Canada, who have quite different laws to us, but very successful laws. You rarely see people, I think it's 99.9% successful, only a tiny amount of people who are abusing the legislation, tiny. But the rest of it, everyone overwhelmingly aligns with it. So it's done in a very ethical and proper kind of way.
So do you feel as though when you first started talking about it, really most people were on board? It wasn't one of those things where we had to convince people.
No, that's right, except for people who were particularly religious. Because let's face it, everyone, pretty much, unless you're quite young, has had a loved one die. So this is something that affected everyone.
Yeah. I suppose I was wondering, like some friend the other day, how have you been, blah, blah, blah. And he went, I had a weird thing yesterday, like my uncle died. And I went, that's it. And he said, no, it was voluntary. He did the voluntary assisted death. He died yesterday afternoon at 2:00. I went, oh, wow. You were there? Yeah, we were all there. And, it was great. We had a lovely morning with him. We had dinner the night before, and then it just all took place. I said, wow, how amazing. And what I was really struck by was what a normal conversation this was. It was a bit like saying, we went to holiday in Queensland. It was sort of, he wasn't describing some outlandish thing. It was suddenly voluntary assisted dying was just part of the fabric of our lives. Do you feel that that's happened in Australia?
I do feel it's become more normalised, to your point, over the last 20 years. But there's still a lot of academic debate about at what point should you be able to do it. At the moment in Australia, it's overwhelmingly someone with a terminal illness, and it's done by themselves or their doctor, their practitioner. But there are people who want to bring it in for people who are elderly and suffering and don't want to live any longer to support them there. So we're seeing, I guess, a fragmentation of the discussion and the arguments, and I'll be interested to see which way that goes down the track. There's a lot of debate about people, to your point earlier with Alzheimer's, people who have dementia.
Sensory pleasures, like people being able to taste and smell and touch and hug, become really important at the end of life.
Oh, that reminds me of someone I know who did have a good death, who was my grandfather, Mum's father. He lived until 94, and I cared for him towards the end of his life. Our kids were little then. They were probably 7 and 8. And he had that burst, and they said, come on in, he'll die in the next couple of days. We brought in oysters. We brought in red wine. I brought in the kids because I think it was important for them to see that. And he had a good death within the next 24 hours. So it is possible. I think it's rare, but it's possible.
Yeah, it's happening. A lot of your speciality, Hannah, is in Buddhism and studying Buddhism. What do the Buddhists make of voluntary assisted dying?
Well, I will say that Buddhism is a religion with over 500 million people in it. So it's kind of like asking, what are the Christians, right. Or what are the Western people think about voluntary assisted dying? So range of views. Huge range
I
of
suppose
views.
I was just wondering whether there was anything in the Buddhist canon as such, or the Buddhist view that just went, no, let life take its course. That's, you must experience suffering, so therefore you must experience all of life.
Suffering's pretty important to Buddhism, right?
Yeah.
And suffering well and learning to suffer well is really important. So there are some Buddhists who would oppose voluntary assisted dying because there's a prohibition against killing, right? But most people in Buddhism will weigh that prohibition against killing against kind of the experience of suffering, right? And lessening people's suffering. So certainly there are some Buddhists who would say, no, we need to experience suffering and learn how to experience the suffering at the end of life. And that can be quite instructive. It's also why some Buddhists may deny pain medication and even, deny anything that kind of clogs their mind because they want to be conscious at the end of life. They want to experience it all, see where their consciousness goes to the next reincarnation. But there's also a massive Buddhist movement that has always kind of seen humanity on quite a similar level to animals, right? That we are all beings of this world, and therefore in the same way that we would, have compassion for the suffering of a pet, and, euthanize a pet that's going through unavoidable suffering. There's many Buddhists who would therefore support the euthanasia of a human being that's going through suffering, right? In the same way, because humans are not particularly special, right? We're just another being in this world, and we want to show the same compassion for both of those.
Yeah.
Huge range of views.
Yeah. Tracy, you said you're an atheist. Does that mean, once the final curtain falls, that's it?
Well, I'm one of those very open-minded atheists, James, who, if I am diagnosed with something, I fully am open to the opportunity of religion if I end up needing it at that time. And I imagine a lot of people do.
Okay.
And if I do decide to do that, I would choose Buddhism.
There's actually a fascinating piece of research that just came out, Professor Manning, a religious studies scholar, and she looked at older atheists and what they think about the end of life. Because we tend to think, well, religious people have beliefs, but we don't really study atheists' beliefs, right? We just think they all think nothing. But she actually found that there was kind of 3 different kind of worldviews or narratives that came out that can be summarized as lights out, recycling, or mystery. Okay? I'll walk you through.
I'm all three.
So the first one is this idea, it's kind of like death is like anesthesia. That's it. At the end, there's nothing, and it's often very biomedical, right? it's like sleep, but you don't dream. So it's more like anesthesia. We've all maybe all experienced that. And that's what these people believe, that will be the end. The second one is recycling. So this is the food for worms idea, right? That yes, I will die, but Carl Sagan, we're all made of stardust, right? We'll go back into the universe and one day I will be an oak tree or something quite, beautiful idea, which I subscribe to that. I quite like that. And then the third one that they described around atheists was just mystery, that there for a certain group of people, who knows? And we can't ask anyone. And so that it was almost kind of curiosity and excitement towards the end of life.
Yeah.
So there are, this is quite a great mystery. It's a great adventure, right? That we should all go on.
Fantastic. We didn't talk much about, I suppose, the emotion we might feel around death at various points. Again, I've observed this through lots of conversations on the radio where my parents' generation, stiff upper lip.
Stoicism.
How's she doing? Oh, very well. Which meant she wasn't feeling anything at all. There'd been no, that's sort of how you're meant to feel. We now tend to be very emotional about death. It's part of our funeral rites, I suppose, to release that, to make sure we all howl.
Yeah, we have this kind of catharsis model of the funeral, right? Which is this idea that, you kind of, even if you might not want to, you go to the funeral and you cry it all out with other people and you have this communal experience of grief. And somehow that is helpful, if not entirely necessary for our long-term grief. But, there's many cultures around the world where wailing is a big tradition, right? So that, women physically throwing themselves at the coffin, howling, collectively crying. It might be an extended period of wearing a certain color, wearing black, gathering together. Those kind of rituals can also be a way for people to process grief and emotion. You think of particularly, in the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva, right, that, after someone dies, you immediately gather, right, and there's an extended period of everyone sitting together and dedicated to experiencing grief together. That's quite different to our kind of one-day funeral a week or two after the person's died and we all go back to our home.
Yeah.
And it kind of depends on, what kind of level of social ties that your culture or society engages in the funeral, right? Do you have a very small private funeral where it's only the immediate family who are the ones that are supposed to be grieving? Or is it everyone you knew in that society and you have a responsibility to go and be there because you're part of a much larger social fabric, right? And that can be quite different. It can be a 300 or 400 person funeral. One of the largest social groups in Australia is South Asian, Indian, Hindu migration, right? Often extremely large funerals, 300, 400 people in some cases, right? Because there's a different expectation about who are the mourners, who is the congregation, who are the people that gather together and stand against death, as it were.
Another big difference seems to me, and I'd love to hear more about you on this, is the cultures that sit with the body for 3 days or have the open coffin viewing.
Well, the body stays at home.
Of the body, or the body stays at home, because my sister and I sat with Mum's body for as long as we were legally and practically allowed to in the hospital, which was hours and hours and hours. And when we told a lot of our Western friends, they said, what an awful thing to do. But it was really lovely because it cemented the idea that she was actually gone. We told her stories. My sister and I laughed. We cried. It was actually incredibly therapeutic.
Yeah, and this is one of the difficulties is people feel because they have people don't have a lot of information, right? So if you're lucky, very lucky, then you'll organise maybe 1 or 2 funerals during your whole life, right? And probably there'll be those for your parents, right? And you just don't have a lot of information because we don't talk about it. So you don't know what you're allowed to do. But, in all states and territories across Australia, you are allowed to be with that body for an extended period of time. You're allowed to bring that body home. You can actively resist pressures from the hospital and the hospice and everyone else to get you out the door. You can say, no, I would like to be with this body for a bit longer. And as you say, there is also technologies that can allow you to bring the body into the home. I mean, the reason we call them funeral parlours is the front parlour of the house. Right. That is the room where we used to display the body and be with the body, and that still occurs in many cultures around the world. You know, it's difficult. It can be difficult. It's not always the right decision. You have to think about your particular circumstances, but it is possible.
Well, thanks so much. Any final words?
Only that I think we should all choose our own funeral soundtrack. I've been doing that with a girlfriend lately.
What's she gone with?
Because, I've gone with Edith Piaf. No
classic.
regrets, of course.
Classic.
Absolute classic. And my friend is still choosing from 5. But I think otherwise someone else gets a choice. They might choose something terrible.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's very important. Get your funeral song sorted out.
Catering, funeral
whole
song.
soundtrack, the catering you'd be concerned about. You want everyone to have something.
Delicious.
Any special cheeses or wines?
French, this is what we did for my dad as well. It was like red wine, good French trees, baguettes. If you're going to grieve, you're going to cry, you need some sustenance to support you.
Comfort food.
Comfort food, exactly.
Yeah, very nice.
Before we let you go, what's your funeral song?
What do I want people to hear as the coffin's going out or something like that?
Yeah.
I don't know if I've made that choice yet. Don't know.
Hard rock?
Jazz?
No, it'll be something jazz, I guess, or something in that tradition. It's probably none of the Frank songs.
Something majestic, though.
Something as Zadok the priest handles sort of something
old school.
Something huge. I haven't decided. Yeah, but you're right. Like everything, do it. Put some effort into it, and have all that stuff ready for your children, for those that are going to have to do it, little folder somewhere.
You could play some of your television clips from over the years.
Oh, I don't think so, Tracy. I didn't think yours might have something.
Highlights reel.
Yeah,
the
show reel.
Yeah, my show reel. No, let's not do that. It's largely children's television, Tracy. No one wants to see that.
It would be great if you...
I'd like to conduct a from Beyond the Grave talkback session, probably talkback radio or something. That could be very
People
fun.
could all call into your funeral.
I love that. It's a simul funeral. It's being broadcast on the station, and then people can call in with their tributes. Oh, that's good.
Anything is possible.
That is good. Okay, we've got it. Thank you for helping me sort that
Let's
out.
run with that.
We've done it.
Well, thanks so much to our guests, Dr. Hannah Gould and Tracy Spicer. You've been listening to Season 6 of Life's Booming, Dying to Know, brought to you by Australian Seniors. Please leave a review or tell someone about it. If you want more, head to seniors.com.au/podcast. May your life be booming. I'm James Valentine.